Have you ever stood at a graveside, surrounded by people who pretended to mourn, only to realize you were the only one there who truly lost something? That was me, clutching the folded obituary of my husband, watching his family play dress-up in grief. I thought death was the hardest part, but I was wrong. The real betrayal came after the funeral, when I discovered just how far they'd go to erase me and steal everything he and I had built together. Before I dive into this story, let me say this. If you've ever been underestimated, cut out, or treated like you didn't matter, stick with me. Because what they did to me nearly broke me. But the revenge? Oh, the revenge rebuilt me and left them with nothing. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because here, we don't just tell stories, we take back our. My name is Claire Reynolds. I met David when I was 24. I was working as a junior marketing associate in Charlotte, fresh out of college, broke, and barely holding my life together. He was 30, a quiet but confident engineer who carried himself like someone who knew exactly where he was going. We met at a friend's barbecue. It was one of those humid North Carolina nights when the air clings to your skin and the smell of charcoal sticks to your clothes. I remember laughing at something my friend Rachel said, only to glance across the yard and find David watching me. Not in a creepy way, more like he'd already decided I was the most interesting thing in the room. He walked over, introduced himself, and within minutes we were talking like old friends. By the end of the night, he'd asked me out. Our relationship wasn't flashy. It was steady, reliable, a slow burn instead of fireworks. But that's exactly what I needed. He was the kind of man who remembered to change the oil in my car, who showed up at my office when I pulled an all-nighter with takeout and coffee, who held me when the weight of the world made me cry. 3 years later, he proposed. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard just outside Asheville. Nothing extravagant, just close friends, a few family members, vows spoken under twinkling lights. For me, it was perfect. But if you asked his family, they'd say otherwise. David's parents, especially his mother Marjorie, never liked me. From day one, she made it clear I wasn't good enough for her son. Too plain, too middle class, not from the right circle. I'll never forget the first Thanksgiving I spent with them. Marjorie leaned across the table, her pearls glinting under the chandelier, and asked, "So Claire, when do you plan to stop working and focus on giving David children?" "You know, the important things." David squeezed my hand under the table, but I forced a polite smile and said, "Well, I think building my career is important too." She sniffed, clearly unimpressed. That set the tone for the rest of our marriage. David was the buffer between us. He defended me, always, but I could tell it wore on him. That tug of war between loyalty to his wife and obligation to his parents. Won. And then, just 10 years into our marriage, tragedy struck. David was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. It blindsided us. He was 39, healthy, active, but the doctors were clear. It was serious, and time wasn't on our side. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, medications, and nights spent lying awake, listening to his breathing, terrified it might stop. Through it all, his parents hovered, not to support us, but to criticize. "You're not taking good enough care of him," Marjorie accused one night at the hospital. "If you had insisted on better doctors, maybe he'd be doing better." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. David, weak but defiant, rasped, "Mum, stop. Claire's the one keeping me alive right now," but she never did stop. When David passed, it felt like the world collapsed in on itself. I sat in that hospital room, holding his cold hand, numb. The love of my life was gone, and I didn't know how to breathe without him. The funeral was worse. His family turned it into a spectacle, lavish flowers, endless speeches about what a perfect son he was, how much they had shaped him. Not one mention of me, not one acknowledgement that I'd been his wife for a decade. People gave me polite, pitying looks, as if I were just some footnote. And then came the real gut punch. A week after the funeral, I met with the lawyer to review David's will. My hand shook as I unfolded the papers, expecting at least some comfort in knowing he'd taken care of me. But instead, I felt the blood drain from my face. The will had been changed. Everything, our house, his savings, even his life insurance, was left to his parents. I got nothing, not even a token mention. I stammered, This can't be right. David would never. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. It stated 2 months before his passing, properly signed and notarized. I felt like I was drowning. 2 months before his death, David had been in and out of the hospital, barely coherent from the medications. There was no way he'd willingly cut me out, which meant only one thing: Marjorie. The realization hit like ice in my veins. She had manipulated him, or worse, forged his signature. And now, with him gone, she held all the cards. That night, I sat in the house David and I had shared, staring at the walls, grief mixing with rage. I thought I'd hit rock bottom at his funeral, but this was betrayal on a whole new level. They hadn't just stolen my husband from me, they were trying to erase me entirely, and I swore then, through tears and fury, that I wouldn't let them win. Grief doesn't come in neat stages. People tell you about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, but in reality, it's all of them at once, crashing over you like waves, knocking you off your feet before you can breathe. After David's funeral, I lived in that storm. The house was too quiet. His side of the bed stayed cold. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text him, only to remember that there was no one on the other end anymore. But as unbearable as grief was, betrayal cut deeper. The will sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded gun. Every time I walked by, it mocked me. His signature, scrawled at the bottom, didn't even look like his. Shaky, unnatural. My gut screamed that it wasn't real, but my heart screamed louder. Why would he do this? Why would he leave me with nothing? The questions kept me awake at night, pacing the darkened living room. I wanted to believe David hadn't done this to me, that he hadn't cut me out like I was disposable, but the papers said otherwise, and Marjorie wasted no time twisting the knife. The first phone call came 2 days after the will was read. "Claire," she said, her voice clipped, businesslike. "I'll be coming by the house on Saturday. Please have your belongings packed." I froze. "My belongings? This is my home." "Not anymore," she replied smoothly. "Legally, the house belongs to me and Charles now. I've already spoken to the lawyer. We'll be taking possession by the end of the month." My hand shook. "Marjorie, I lived here with David. This was our home. You can't just..." "Don't make this harder on yourself," she interrupted. "It's unbecoming." Then she hung up. I sank to the floor, phone slipping from my hands, sobs racking my chest. The home David and I built together, the kitchen where we cooked Sunday breakfasts, the porch where we drank wine under the stars, the living room where we danced to music no one else could hear. It was all being ripped away. And worse, she expected me to leave quietly, to slink away like I'd never mattered. But I didn't leave. Not yet. The next week was a blur of small humiliations. Marjorie began showing up unannounced, striding through the house like she already owned it. One morning, I found her in the kitchen, rifling through drawers. "What are you doing?" I demanded, clutching my robe tight around me. "Taking inventory," she said without looking up. Some of this china belonged to David's grandmother. It doesn't belong to you. That's my wedding china, I snapped. David and I picked it out together. She gave me a thin smile. Funny, I don't recall you paying for it. Every visit was like that. Her staking claim, me scrambling to defend scraps of my life. And always, her veiled barbs. David told me once he worried about your spending habits. Perhaps that's why he made the changes to his will. Such a shame you never gave him children. He might have thought twice if you had. You were always pleasant. But David needed someone stronger. Each comment chipped away at me, planting seeds of doubt. Had David really lost faith in me? Had he thought me unworthy in the end? At night, I lay awake replaying our last conversations, desperate for reassurance I couldn't find. The worst moment came when I visited the bank. I needed to access our joint account to pay the bills piling up on the kitchen counter. But when I handed over my ID, the teller gave me a sympathetic look. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. Your name has been removed from the account. What? My voice cracked. That's not possible. I'm his wife. It was our account. She tapped at her screen, then shook her head. 2 months ago, the account was transferred solely into David's name. Upon his passing, the funds defaulted to his listed beneficiaries. I didn't need to ask who those were. I stumbled out of the bank, nausea twisting my stomach. The last of my financial security had vanished. Bills piled higher, mortgage, utilities, car payments. Without access to our savings, I had only my modest salary from the marketing firm, and grief had wrecked my ability to function. My work slipped, deadlines passed. I found myself staring at blank screens for hours, unable to string words together. My boss, sympathetic but firm, called me into his office. Claire, I know you're going through a lot, but if your performance doesn't improve, we'll have to reconsider your role here. I nodded mutely, shame burning my cheeks. Marjorie was taking everything, and I was too broken to stop her. Then came the final humiliation. It was a Saturday afternoon when I heard the knock. Expecting a neighbour, I opened the door to find Marjorie standing there with a real estate agent. What is this? I demanded. She brushed past me, heels clicking on the hardwood. I'm showing the house. You've had more than enough time to make arrangements. The agent, clearly uncomfortable, avoided my eyes. Rage surged through me. You can't just barge in here. This is my property, Marjorie snapped. You're a guest, and an ungrateful one at that. Consider this your notice. I wanted to scream, to throw her out, to burn the papers she clutched in her manicured hands. But instead, I stood frozen, as strangers wandered through my living room, commentating on the crown molding and the spacious backyard, as if my life were just another listing on Zillow. That night, I broke. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, surrounded by boxes I hadn't packed, clutching one of David's old sweatshirts to my chest. This everyone was a calm, and behind me, no one could save me, watched her. I snapped until my throat was raw, until my sun was warm, and indeed was brightness. For the first time since his death, I whispered into the darkness, David, why did you leave me like this? Why didn't you protect me? There was no answer, just silence. But in that silence, something shifted. As the tears slowed, a thought surfaced. What if he didn't do this? What if it wasn't his choice at all? The signature on the will, the sudden removal from our bank accounts, the convenient timing during his hospital stays, it all pointed to one thing: Marjorie. The grief was still heavy, but beneath it, something hotter flickered. Anger. And anger, I realized, could keep me alive. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Andrea Torres, sharp-eyed and relentless. I laid everything out, the sudden will change, the altered bank accounts, Marjorie's constant intrusions. She listened intently, tapping notes into her tablet. Finally, she looked up. Claire, I'll be honest, challenging a will is an uphill battle, but based on what you've told me, there are red flags. The timing, the signature, the fact that he was medicated. If we can prove undue influence or fraud, you may have a case. Hope flared, fragile but real. So I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining this. Andrea shook her head firmly. No, you're not crazy. You were manipulated. That validation, that one sentence, was like oxygen after drowning. But as Andrea laid out the steps ahead, document reviews, handwriting experts, depositions, I realized this wasn't just about getting the house back or the money. This was about justice. About making Marjorie choke on the empire she thought she could steal. About proving that I wasn't invisible, that I had mattered to David, no matter how hard they tried to erase me. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to clarity. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, I could turn it in my favor. Anger has a way of sharpening you. Grief left me hollow, but anger gave me edges. Once Andrea told me I wasn't crazy, that I'd been manipulated, something inside me hardened. For weeks I had been drowning, but now I was learning how to swim with bricks tied to my feet. The first step was evidence. Andrea made it clear. Judges don't rule on feelings, Claire. They rule on proof. If we're going to win, we need more than suspicion. We need to show your husband was incapable of making those changes, or that Marjorie directly influenced him. So, I dug. I started with David's hospital records. Pages and pages of medication logs, notes from doctors, nurses' observations. The man was on heady doses of morphine and sedatives for most of his final months. He couldn't focus on crossword puzzles, let alone rewrite a legal will. One line in particular made my blood run cold. Patient appears disoriented, unable to sign consent forms without assistance. That note was dated the very same week the will had been updated. I pressed my palm against the page, my pulse racing. Proof. But I didn't stop there. Andrea suggested we bring in a handwriting expert. I dug out old birthday cards, mortgage forms, love notes David had written me over the years. His handwriting was steady, strong, loops precise. The signature on the new will? Shaky, uneven, almost like someone had tried to copy it from memory. The expert didn't mince words. I'd bet my career this signature was forged. Still, Andrea warned me. Marjorie will have explanations. She'll say David was weak but lucid. She'll say he wanted to secure his parents' future. She'll paint you as the bitter widow trying to cash in. I clenched my fists. Then we'll beat her at her own game. Step 2 was witnesses. I began reaching out to nurses who had cared for David. Some were hesitant. Confidentiality, fear of laws, but a few. But all felt more open. One nurse, Rebecca, remembered Marjorie vividly. She was always hovering, Rebecca said, always whispering to him when no one else was around. Once, I walked in and heard her saying something about making things right and protecting the family name. When she saw me, she shut up quick. I swallowed hard. Do you think she could have influenced him? Rebecca's eyes met mine. Influenced. Honey, she controlled every conversation when she was in that room. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and with every new detail, my confidence grew. But evidence wasn't enough. Not for me. Revenge, true revenge, required exposure. I didn't just want to win quietly in court. I wanted to strip Marjorie of her mask, to make the world see her for what she really was. So I started planning beyond the courtroom. I thought about every humiliation she'd put me through. The time she barged into my home, the whispers at the funeral, the smug way she told me to pack my things. For years, she thrived on image. Reputation was her weapon. Fine, I'd turn it against her. Andrea raised an eyebrow when I told her. Claire, legal cases are delicate. Public opinion can complicate things. I don't care, I said firmly. This isn't just about winning a case, it's about destroying her narrative. She wants the world to see me as disposable. I'll make sure they see her as the fraud. Andrea studied me for a long moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. Then let's make it airtight. Step 3 was allies. I reached out to people who had seen the way Marjorie treated me over the years, friends who'd heard her cutting remarks at family gatherings, neighbors who'd noticed how she inserted herself into our lives. Even David's cousin Emily, who admitted quietly, "Marjorie always hated you. She told me once she wished David had married someone more useful." When I asked Emily if she'd testify, she hesitated. It would cause a war in the family. I looked her dead in the eye. There's already a war. The only question is which side you're on. Slowly, people began to choose. Not everyone, but enough. Step 4 was patience. Revenge isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And I learned to savor the planning, to let anticipation steady me on nights when grief still threatened to crush me. I visualized it. Marjorie, I visualized it, sitting in court, forced to listen as experts shredded her lies, the whispers spreading through town as people realized she'd stolen from her dying son's wife. That image carried me through. But revenge has a way of testing you. One night, about 3 months into preparation, I got an unexpected call. It was Charles David's father. His voice was shaky, tired. "Claire," he said softly, "I know things have been difficult, but I want you to know, I never wanted this." I gripped the phone, unsure how to respond. "Then why didn't you stop her?" There was a long pause. "Your mother-in-law. She's very persuasive. She said it was for the best, that David wanted it. I wanted to believe her." I let out a bitter laugh. "You wanted peace, at my expense." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Truly, I miss David, and I know he loved you." His words cracked something in me. Part of me wanted to believe him, to forgive, but another part hardened. He'd chosen silence when I needed him most. He'd chosen Marjorie's comfort over my survival. "Sorry doesn't give me my life back," I said coldly, and hung up. As the court date drew closer, Marjorie tried her own tactics. Letters from her lawyer accusing me of gold digging. Nasty rumors whispered through mutual acquaintances, claims that I'd spent irresponsibly, that I'd been planning to divorce him anyway. Each lie fueled me. Andrea, ever pragmatic, reminded me, "We don't need to fight every rumor. We just need to win in front of the judge." But I wasn't just aiming for the judge. I was aiming for the world. So I began preparing my own bombshell. I compiled everything, the medical records, the handwriting analysis, the testimonies, the timeline. But I also wrote my story, raw, unfiltered, painful. I described how I met David, how we built a life, how his illness tore through us, and how his mother tried to erase me. I didn't publish it, not yet. Timing was everything, but it sat in a folder on my desktop, waiting, like a loaded gun. The night before the trial, I barely slept. I paced the living room, clutching David's sweatshirt, memories clawing at me. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if I lost? What if all this pain in preparation led to nothing? But then I remembered Marjorie's smirk at the lawyer's office. The way she told me to pack my things like I was a tenant, not a wife. The way she dismissed my grief as unbecoming. And my fear turned to fire. "Tomorrow," I whispered into the dark, "you fall." The courthouse felt colder than I expected, not just from the air conditioning humming overhead, but from the weight of what was about to happen. My palms were damp, my chest tight, but I forced myself to stand tall. This was it. The day I took everything back. Marjorie was already inside when Andrea and I walked in. She looked like she was about to host a fundraiser, not defend herself in court. Pearls, perfect hair, lips painted that sharp red. When her eyes landed on me, she smirked. That smirk had haunted me for months, but today I met it with steel. The judge entered. "Court is now in session." Marjorie's lawyer went first, painting me as a bitter widow. "Mrs. Reynolds cannot accept her late husband's wishes. Out of spite and greed, she seeks to undo the will. Greed. That word burned. They had taken everything, and yet here I was, the one accused of greed. Andrea rose next. Her voice was calm, steady. Your Honor, this isn't about grief. It's about fraud. The will was changed when David Reynolds was incapacitated, heavily medicated, and incapable of legal decisions. We will prove undue influence and forgery. The first witness was Dr. Patel, one of David's physicians. He explained the heavy sedation, the confusion, the fact that David often couldn't recognize people. In my opinion, he was not capable of making serious legal decisions at that time, he testified. I saw Marjorie stiffen, her lips pressed tight. Next came the handwriting expert. He projected David's signatures onto the screen, old mortgage papers, birthday cards, insurance forms. The loops were strong, the strokes confident. Then came the will. This, the expert said firmly, is not the same hand. It shows hesitation, inconsistency, and signs of forgery. Where is that? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I glanced at Marjorie. Her face was pale beneath the foundation. Finally, Rebecca the nurse took the stand. Her voice was steady but compassionate. Mrs. Reynolds often whispered to David when no one else was in the room. Once I heard her say, "Don't worry, I'll make sure things are handled my way." He was too weak to resist. The words hit like thunder. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling, but not from fear. From victory inching closer. Then it was Marjorie's turn. She strode to the stand, her chin high. My son loved me. He wanted to ensure we were cared for. Claire, she paused, her voice dripping false sorrow, was never responsible. He told me he worried about her. I only helped him honor his wishes. Andrea's cross-examination cut through her act like a knife. You claim your son was of sound mind, yet his doctor testified otherwise. Are you suggesting the medical staff lied? Marjorie shifted. Doctors exaggerate. And the handwriting expert. Andrea pressed. His illness, it changed things. Andrea's voice sharpened. And what about the bank? Why did you attempt to transfer funds into your personal account just weeks after the will was changed? Gasps erupted in the room. Marjorie froze, her face draining of color. I don't recall. That was it. The crack in her armor. When closing arguments ended, the judge left to deliberate. The silence was unbearable. My chest ached, my mind racing with every possibility. But when Judge Barrett returned, her voice was clear, firm. This court finds that the will was procured under undue influence and is invalid. The estate reverts to the prior will, designating Claire Reynolds as the primary beneficiary. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then the words sank in. I'd won. Andrea squeezed my arm. Around us, whispers filled the courtroom. People turned to look at Marjorie, not with admiration, but with disgust. She leaned toward me as the room emptied, her voice venomous. You think this makes you better than me? I stood, calm and steady. No, Marjorie, it proves I was never beneath you. Walking out of that courthouse into the sunlight felt like stepping into freedom. Not just legal victory, but justice. Real, undeniable justice. And for the first time since David's death, I felt like I could finally breathe. The first thing I noticed after the verdict wasn't celebration. It was the way people looked at Marjorie now. Less fear, more curiosity, then pity, and finally, quiet contempt. Reputation is a currency. Once it evaporates, people close their doors and their wallets. And that's exactly what happened to her. Within days, patients who had been with the clinic for decades started requesting new physicians. Word travels fast in a small town, faster when it's scandalous. The clinic's schedule became patchy. Nurses called in sick more often. Volunteers who had once heartily supported Marjorie's charity drives stopped returning her calls. The country club where she hosted luncheons sent a polite note saying they were reviewing memberships. Donations dried up like a faucet turned off. Charles, who had always been the quieter partner in their empire, began to look older. The confident gait was gone. He started coming to the house later, avoiding neighbors. Once, I saw him at the grocery store. He glanced at me, then at the floor, as if my presence were a fresh bruise he couldn't bear to see. I didn't approach him. Words wouldn't have helped. He'd spoken his piece in court when he chose silence over defense. Silence had consequences. Grace, bless her, fell apart in ways I hadn't expected. For years she'd been polished and protected. Now she had to live with the reality that her life's foundation was built on theft. People who had celebrated her wedding stopped answering RSVPs. Brands that had once courted her social media presence began withdrawing offers. Daniel's colleagues exchanged awkward looks when she walked into the hospital lobby. The facade didn't crumble all at once, those things rarely do, but it splintered, and the sound of it breaking reverberated. Someone once told me that public shaming is cheap revenge, but watching it happen felt less like vindictiveness and more like exposure. People felt cheated, and their response was natural. They turned away. There's a difference between being held accountable and being destroyed for spectacle. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted consequences. I wanted everybody who turned a blind eye for the sake of convenience to understand there were real human costs to their indifference. Marjorie tried PR at first, press releases about family privacy, statements about misunderstanding and regret, but Spen only works when the story's not already written. The evidence had teeth. Friends who'd once lined up to be at her side now used excuses like scheduling conflicts. She posted carefully curated photos on social media, empty platitudes about family and forgiveness, but the comments betrayed the truth. Old acquaintances posted memories, exposing the disparity between her online persona and private actions. The comments thread read like a slow public autopsy. Legally, things moved too. The bank flagged questionable transactions. The board of the clinic demanded audits. Grants that had been approved months ago were put on hold pending review. The institution that had once been built on the Reynolds name began to distance itself. Contracts got reviewed. Sponsors stepped back. What had been a solid foundation for years now felt like sand underfoot. And yet, life at my house was ordinary in the best sense. The day-to-day after the courtroom victory was quiet, warm, and steady. I woke when Leo clambered into our room with his hair sticking up like a dandelion, and the world felt safe. He'd been through shock too. Kids sense a parent's strain in ways we underestimate, but he recovered quickly. He wanted pancakes on Tuesday and soccer practice on Wednesday, and to show me every drawing he'd made. That mundane normality was surgical in its healing. It stitched me back together in tiny, deliberate ways. Neighbors who once offered polite nods began offering casseroles and garden produce. Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down, brought over empanadas and insisted I let her know if I needed anything, as if to compensate for a town's collective silence during my worst days. Aunt Betsy, who had always quietly disliked the Reynolds veneer, took me to lunch and said, "You did what the rest of them were too greedy to do. Stand up." Those small, genuine gestures mattered more than any headline. But there were also scars that refused to fade. People I thought would stand with me wavered. Some relatives, conveniently distant during my grief, suddenly cooled, awkward and insistent on reunion. I listened to them and politely declined. Forgiveness without accountability felt like permission, and I wasn't in the mood to grant either. Daniel came to me quietly one afternoon, walking up the path to our house, like a man who had rehearsed the steps 1,000 times. He'd split from Grace. The marriage blessed on paper had cracked under the weight of her choices and the shame that followed. He sat on my porch step, and didn't immediately mention divorce, or alimony, or who kept what. He asked about Leo, he asked about me, he apologized, at least that's what he called it, for not seeing sooner. He told me he'd been lied to, manipulated by someone he loved and trusted, and it changed him in ways he'd been slow to understand. "What do you want from me?" I asked, blunt, because I was tired of half phrases and bandage apologies. He looked at Leo playing in the yard, and then at me. "Nothing. I want to do right by my son. I want to be honest, that's all." For a long time I'd equated revenge with ruin. My version of victory was seeing them fall. But the real measure of success came later, in quieter things. A stable bank account that no one could touch, bills paid on time, the smell of fresh bread when Leo came home from school. It was the knowledge that he, my husband, had not been erased by their lies, that the life we had built together had a chance to continue, unmolested. The town itself seemed to recalibrate. Where once people had deferred to the Reynolds' presence, they now nodded to me with respect. It wasn't vindictive, it was recognition. A few of David's former colleagues reached out to tell me about his better side, the man he was away from his mother's stage side. Those stories felt intimate and sacred. It was as if finally someone else remembered the real him. There were difficult nights, still. Lawsuits take up time and emotional bandwidth. There were depositions and media calls and questions that cut too close to memory. Friends I'd expected to be omnipresent thinned out when the legal hassle dragged on. Grief does not end with a ruling. It becomes a companion that sometimes walks in front of you and sometimes behind. I learned to live around it, to carry it without letting it define every sentence. And Marjorie? She faded. Not in the dramatic blaze of humiliation that sensationalist headlines promise, but in a slow, eroding way. Her invitations stopped arriving. Her charity events had to be postponed, then cancelled. She sat through months of awkward silences at community meetings. People spoke to Charles without looking in her direction. The empire they'd built had cracks deep enough to swallow the noise it used to make. Once, months later, I ran into her at the town library. She looked up as I passed, and something like recognition flickered across her face, brief and then gone. Her posture tightened, as if she imagined me the same broken woman she had dismissed months before. I stopped. The air felt thin between us. "You hurt him," I said simply. Her mouth opened, closed. "I acted for the family," she started, a rehearsed line that had failed her in court. "For the family," I repeated. "You mean for your version of it. You don't get to call that a sacrifice when you stole my life." She lowered her eyes, and for the first time I saw something like regret, not the kind you say into microphones, but a private, quiet one that didn't absolve her. Then she turned and walked away. No apology, no explanation. That absence was its own kind of reply. The rest of my life moved forward, not smoothly, life never does, but with a deliberate intent. I set up a trust so nothing like what happened could ever happen to Leo. I went back to work, re-establishing routines and setting boundaries. I reconnected with friends who had been distant out of awkwardness and pain. I allowed myself to be seen in ways I had denied for years. And slowly, the pain of losing David softened into memory. Gitcher stayed vivid, his laugh when he messed up a recipe, the way his hand found mine in crowds. But those memories no longer cut like knives. They were warm and human, a place I could visit without collapsing. If you asked me then whether revenge had been worth it, I would have answered, yes, but only because it led to reclamation. I didn't want Marjorie's ruin for entertainment. I wanted justice and the restoration of what was rightfully mine. And we got that. The rest, the quiet satisfaction, the freedom to raise my son without fear, the knowledge that we had each other, was the prize. As the town moved on and summer rolled into fall, I would often sit on the back porch and watch Leo ride his bike in circles, his laughter ringing through the yard. I breathe the warm air in, let it fill my lungs, and feel something steady and solid inside. Not triumph in the petty sense, but the deep, marrow-level relief that comes when you finally set down a burden you were not meant to carry. That was the final, sweetest fallout of all. Peace. In the end, justice didn't roar. It whispered and killed men. Some would remove their pieces. It whispered in the silence of a house that was finally mine again, in the steady rhythm of bills paid on time, in the sound of my son's laughter echoing through rooms they had tried to take away from us. For a long time, I thought revenge meant fire burning their empire to the ground, making them suffer as I had. And yes, watching Marjorie unravel in that courtroom, watching the town turn its back on her, there was satisfaction in that. But the real victory was quieter. It was improving, once and for all, that I mattered, that our love, our life, was not so easily erased. Grief still walks beside me. Some nights I still reach for David, still ache at the empty space he left behind. But I no longer carry the shame or the fear they tried to brand me with. I carry something stronger, freedom. And that, in the truest sense, was my revenge. So tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have fought until the truth was dragged into the light? If my story hit you, if it made you clench your fists when they lied, or smile when justice was served, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of justice, revenge. And share this with someone who needs a reminder, no matter how dark betrayal feels, the truth always finds a way to shine. Because revenge isn't just about tearing them down. Sometimes it's about rising back up.